Well, welcome to this, I think it's the 8th edition of Pivotal Moments in Australian Radical History, and I'm thinking, why pivotal moments? Why pivotal moments? What makes a pivotal moment? And what actually gives a pivotal moment the momentum it requires? Because as we know, change is about momentum. You create a momentum and it becomes so powerful, even if you lose the battle, as they did at Eureka, that change is inevitable. You have no momentum, you have no change. So what's distinctive about 19th century radical newspapers and 19th century newspapers in Australia? The first thing is there's no distraction in the 19th century. There's no TV, there's no internet, there's no social media, there's no radio, there's no television, there's no telephones, there's no mobile phones, you name it, it doesn't exist. The second thing is most people, not everybody, but most people in Australia have enough literacy to be able to read. You've got to remember in the early 1900s, most people were illiterate because there was no free public education. That didn't occur till the 1870s, 1880. Victoria was the first place in the world to have free, secular, compulsory education, which was introduced by Premier Heals, who Healesville's named after in 1876. So you've got a population that is basically illiterate, and it's a population that has limited access to information, although printing has occurred. Now the history in Great Britain, since the printing presses came out, was a history of quite vigorous radical publications. But what we had here initially was a convict settlement, and which was run by the government of the day. So Australia is based on three concepts: genocide, free labour, and gentlemen of name and quality. And that's what's in the history books till the 1850s. They were the major people who were allowed to come here and set up the squattocracy. So, when you look at newspapers, you see the progression of newspapers and broadsheets in 19th century Australia was linked to the changes which were occurring in society. When you had a purely convict colonial settlement, there was no need for newspapers. You told people what to do, you had the soldiers to enforce those instructions, there was no need for newspapers. But when shipping began in the 1810s and 1820s, and we got some type of economy being developed, colonial economy, you needed mechanisms by which to tell people what ships were coming in, what they were carrying. And the early newspapers, and you'll find this very interesting, the first newspaper that I came across was The Australian, which was published in the 1820s in Sydney. And the fascinating thing about The Australian was that it was owned by Wentworth, who was one of the big squatters in New South Wales. And the main reason he set it up was to actually help coordinate the economic demands at that particular time as ships came in. So it was more of a shipping manual. Now interestingly, the first strike in this country, the first organised strike occurred at the Australian in 1827 by the typesetters, because originally most people were paid not with money, they were paid with lodgings and food. Right? So the first strike occurred in 1827 by the typesetters. That strike was broken by convict labour, because at that particular point in time the government controlled convict labour, and they just put in the convicts to do the typesetting for the Australian. Now there are also good public records of that period in terms of court records, because many of the convicts found themselves in front of magistrates for various, criminal offences. Those of you who were here last time, remember when I spoke about James Strater, who in 1826 was sentenced to 500 lashes, 4 weeks solitary confinement, bread and water, and sent to Port Macquarie for a long sentence if he survived 500 lashes. 4 organising the first known strike, and he was charged with the criminal offence of encouraging his master's servants to combine in order to, the word wasn't force, in order to oblige him to increase their wages and improve their rations, okay? And that's what the sentence. So you've got to remember that as the colonial empire expanded in Australia, the need for communication expanded. And you saw the growth of various newspapers, mainly around various tradespeople who formed unions, which were formed and then collapsed, were formed and collapsed. This is in the 1830s and 1840s. By the 1850s, the ability of people to read and write had improved. Remember, the gold rushes saw an influx of free immigrants come to the colonial Australia, and these free immigrants wanted a little bit more than board and lodgings. So we saw the rise of various newspapers which were there to encourage, which were there to actually promote the interests of various groups, usually tradespeople. Now, whenever there was a significant period in Australian history, the success of that struggle to a significant degree was linked to the availability of a diversity of opinion in the community. Now, I'm going to concentrate on Eureka for a few moments, or maybe 5 to 10 minutes, because everybody remembers the battle, but nobody remembers the history towards the battle and how information was disseminated across the goldfields in basically in a tent city with about 25,000 people. In Ballarat, for 25,000 people, there were 4 newspapers. 4 newspapers. 2 specific to Ballarat, the Ballarat Times, which was, and the editor was Henry Seekamp, and the Diggers Advocate. At the same time, let's not forget, there was the Argus from Melbourne, there was the Herald, and at the beginning of the formation of the Ballarat Reform League on the 11th of November 1854, we saw the emergence of the Age under David Syme. Now, interestingly, the question of gold licence was intrinsically linked to the question of access to land, because once Indigenous people had been removed from the land forcefully and the squatters took over the land, and by the 1850s 700 squatters controlled all of Victoria. One squatter in Brisbane controls 600,000 hectares. So what would happen is you have a dispersal policy where we'd use native police to disperse, that was the word, to talk about genocide. You disperse the local inhabitants in the best way you could with swords, guns, poison, chemical warfare, infectious diseases, you name it. Then the squatters came in, the gentlemen of name and quality, and that's what they were called, gentlemen. These were the sons of the aristocracy in Britain. They'd set up these huge sheep runs because the mills in England, the weaving mills, needed wool. Wool is a perfect product. You shave it, you don't need to refrigerate it, you don't need to do anything to it. You just put it in a bale and you send it back and it's woven. And so these people, they had free labour. All the convicts and the ex-convicts were paid in rations, and the reasons James Strater, as I spoke about before, tried to go on strike was because his rations were cut from 17.5 pounds of wheat a week to 9 pounds of wheat a week. So we get to Ballarat. You've got an influx of over 200,000 people within a 12 to 18 month period into Victoria. Many of these people are refugees from the failed revolutions in 1848 across Europe. Many of them are Chartists from England who are looking for a new life. And, you know, we go and buy a Tats Lotto ticket when there's more than $10 million to be bought. They came here to find gold. Now, the Victorian authorities were exceptionally concerned. The squatters who controlled the Legislative Council, which was the only arm of government, were exceptionally concerned about losing their labour, because as soon as they would heard that gold had been discovered, people would rush off to find their fortune. Gold was initially discovered in 1851, but it was hidden till about the 1853 when it all came out. So they were concerned about losing their cheap labour. So what did they do? Instead of taxing the gold that came out of the ground, they taxed the individual miner. An individual miner was taxed £5 a month to dig a hole 5 metres by 5 metres. It was a month's wages, £5 a month. That was the licence. So the reason that was done, and this is how the whole rebellion started, was to ensure the squatters maintained their cheap labour to rear their sheep and make a killing in many ways. So, at Eureka, as I said, there were 4 papers. There was only one human being who was jailed for the Eureka Rebellion. Only one. And I'll go through the history. You can go. And that was Henry Seekamp. Now, Henry Seekamp was the editor of the Ballarat Times. And he was charged with conspiracy and was sentenced to 3 months jail. People say Lalor was the sword. Well, Seekamp was the pen. We all remember Lalor, who became a turncoat and joined the establishment, but we don't remember Henry Seekamp, who was the pen of Eureka. But the thing about the Ballarat Times was not only did they produce material which supported the miners' struggle, so did David Syme's Age, so did the Argus, so did the Diggers' Advocate. The only paper that was against the Diggers was the Herald, which was the Herald. So what the Ballarat Times is, it opened its press to the Ballarat Reform League. So they were printing posters. So in a tent city, advertising the monster meetings. They were printing and putting out posters free of charge for the Ballarat Reform League to tell people where the meetings were, what the agenda was, when it was going to be held. So the papers then were intrinsically involved in what was happening at that particular point in time, because they were owned by individuals, in the majority of cases, who were basically trying to earn a living from advertising and news, this dissemination of news. So you've got this interesting thing where you've got this diversity of opinion. It's not like today where you've got corporate control. You had diversity of opinion, and as this was the only mechanism, apart from conversation and public meetings and debates, that people came across ideas, what you saw was these papers flourishing. The papers were also responsible, the Argus, the Age, to a significant degree, were responsible for the acquittal of the 13 men who were charged with high treason for their involvement in the Eureka Rebellion. Because what happened is, they were arrested, and the first trials didn't start till February 1855. But the thing was, during that period, these papers were pushing for their release. So what people were reading in the streets were not what the government was talking about, not what the colonial authorities were talking about, not the fact that this was a treasonable activity. They were talking about what was actually happening on a day-to-day basis and the fact that these people shouldn't be on trial. So these are, if you look at some of the articles, you'd be amazed at their political sophistication. And this political sophistication didn't come from nowhere, because we've got to remember that this country in the 19th century was created on the backs of not just criminals but political refugees. We had the Luddites. Well, the Tolpuddle martyrs is a minimal thing which I'm happy to talk about, but we had the Luddites, and we had hundreds, I think about 150 Luddites transported to Australia, and then we had the Swingers. Do you like that? The Swingers. The Swingers were the followers of Captain Swing, who was a mythical leader in the 1830s, and the concept of Captain Swing came from a body swinging in the wind that's been hung, and it was used as a bogeyman to threaten the ruling classes in southern England. Because what happened, there was mechanisation in the weaving, the closure of the common lands, and then there was mechanisation in agriculture. And in the 1830s, there was a huge labourers' revolt, which meant arson, breaking of machinery, because if you lost your job in those days, you lost your ability to survive. Of the 2,000 people that were arrested, under the leadership of the Whig government, and the Attorney General was Lord Melbourne, which this city is named after. Let's not forget that. Lord Melbourne, that's right. He was responsible for the prosecution of the 2,000 that had been arrested, and he said to his magistrates to use the full force of the law against these people who were basically protesting. 259 were sentenced to hang, 19 were hung, but the fascinating thing is that 481 were transported to Australia. So you've got this emerging political class. Now this emerging political class had children, and these children, you may have heard of the term currency lads and lasses, and they use the word currency lads and lasses because they refused to be paid in rations. They wanted cash for their work. So what you've got is the creation of you're moving from a convict ration society to a cash society by people who are born, first generation that was born in this country. So going back to Eureka, if it wasn't for these newspapers, there would have been no Eureka, in my opinion. And even if there was, those that were charged would have been hung. There would have been none of the reforms, land reforms, which followed the major political changes which occurred because of the Eureka Rebellion. Because the government had a big problem. It had a population of about 300,000, and about 75–80% were new immigrants. They wanted access to land. The squatters had bottled the land which they'd originally stolen from the original inhabitants, and they knew that if they didn't come up with universal male suffrage and reforms, that Victoria would go the way of the USA as far as rebellion is concerned. But it was the newspapers. Interestingly, those of you who may have seen early copies of The Age, which David Syme began in 1854, which threw its support behind the Eureka Rebellion, will notice its masthead. And its masthead was the tumbril. You know what the tumbril is? The tumbril was the cart that was used in the French Revolution to carry the condemned to the guillotine. That, and for its 150th anniversary in 2004, I actually had a letter published in The Age which reminded them of their radical past. And I brought up the idea of the tumbril. I don't know when it was removed from the masthead. So these were radical papers with radical ideas in terms of universal suffrage, in terms of access to land. They weren't radical papers in terms of First Nations people, although, this is an interesting aside, that Raphael Carboni was a shepherd in 1853 before he got involved in the gold rush in Ballarat, and he lived with the local people. And when he left Australia after becoming a magistrate, when he left Australia, went back to Italy, he wrote an opera called Gilbernia, which actually was the first written account which saw Aboriginal people as the victims of colonisation. Now, it's little Joe and my hope that one day we will put on this opera. But the way things are going, I think we'll die before it happens.
I've never heard it before.
Oh, nobody's heard about it. The way it was found is an academic was wandering the streets. Was it Verona or somewhere, or Rome? No, it was Rome. He came across a bookstore. This is in the 1970s. He came across a bookstore and he saw actually a copy of Gilbernia for sale. And he actually saw the name and then realised the significance of it and had it translated into English. So what I'm saying is, these were radical newspapers which were run by individuals. They were not run by corporations. The editor was king. So if the editor had a particular slant, like Seekamp talked about it in the Ballarat Times about a new Australian nationalism, which wasn't based on British colonial concepts. So what happens? Well, newspapers come and go after the 1850s. But then we saw a rise in immigration. When convict transportation ceased on the East Coast, about 1846, there was a shortage of labour. There was no more free labour. So they had to encourage people to immigrate to Australia to provide that pool of labour. And as more and more people immigrated to the country and the country grew, as far as the non-Indigenous population was concerned, I think there were 825 in 1788. There's about 425,000 by 1850, and by the 1880s we're talking about 1.5 million people. And so these people were becoming better educated, and even if you weren't educated, you would sit around a campfire and the people who could read would read to you. That was part and parcel of the evening's entertainment. People would read, they'd write poetry, they would read. So you saw as the working classes, in inverted commas, initially the tradespeople became more and more organised and formed trade unions, you saw papers evolve which were actually owned by those trade unions. Things like the Shearers Advocate, the Worker, the Boomerang. These were actually owned by those organisations. And interestingly, Murdoch, or was it Packer? I think it was Packer. Got his start, the Murdoch, the Packer family. No, I think it was the Murdoch family. Got their start in Australia in the 1920s when the New South Wales Trades and Labour Council had set up this is 20th century, they'd set up a state-of-the-art printing press, but there was nobody to run it. So a bent union official sold it to Murdoch. That's how it all started. But that's a different story. Yeah, he sold the whole thing. Nobody realised.
Good story.
It is a good story. It's a real story too. But I'm not sure I'm pretty sure it's Murdoch. But getting back to the 19th century, so you had all these little newspapers cropping up because you relied on advertising and selling the paper. You had little competition apart from other newspapers. You didn't have television, radio, mobile phone, internet, and all that type of stuff. So some of the more interesting papers evolved around the latter part of the 19th century. Papers like The Worker, which was edited by how shall I put it, the interesting William Lane. Now William Lane was a very well-known reporter for some of the more orthodox papers, but he came in across to The Worker, and everybody on The Worker, which started in 1891, was paid the same wage. So and The Worker was basically created during the shearers' strike. Now, interestingly, none of the, and it was established in initially, I think, in Queensland, but none of the news agencies would actually stock it. So they had to go out and actually sell the paper themselves. Now, interestingly, before 1890, newspapers were sent free in the post. If you had a newspaper and you had somebody in Fargaminda, you could post it to them, it would be delivered to them for no cost. And that, to a significant degree, was to spread information, try to create a cohesive Australian colonial identity. So they saw, people who were in the, in the ruling classes saw the newspapers, especially their newspapers, as important. But once we saw the rise of work-based newspapers like The Worker, edited by William Lane, what actually happened is they had to pay postage. They had to pay postage. So a service that was free cost. But the Worker continued to function, and the Boomerang and the Diggers and the Shearers Advocate and all these little papers continued to function because they could survive, because the cost of printing was relatively cheap. You relied on your typesetters. Printing presses were relatively easy to run, and newspapers could be produced. During the shearers' strike, the newspapers and newsletters were exceptionally important in terms of maintaining cohesion in the strike along the East Coast. You think about it.
Year of the shearers' strike?
1891.
Thank you.
So, and then there was another one in 1894, but the 1891. You think about it. You've got a strike down the whole east coast of Australia. That's what, 3,000 to 4,000 kilometres. You have no telephones. You have no telegram. Oh, maybe 1891 you had telegrams. You had no method of communication, so they relied on newspapers to communicate to their members. Now, those of you who remember anybody old enough to remember Marvellous Melbourne in the 1890s? No? 1880s? No? Well, Melbourne was called Marvellous Melbourne after the gold rushes. It was supposed to be the richest city in the world. But by the late 1880s and the early 1890s, Marvellous Melbourne became a dump. It was in the midst of a depression. Things were so bad that 400 people turned up at Pentridge Prison, not Pentridge Prison, the old Melbourne jail, demanding to be let in so they could be fed, right? There were riots in the streets. And this is when the Anarchist Melbourne Club was formed on the 1st of May 1886. Now the Melbourne Anarchist Club, and you can actually access this journal, this newspaper, through the library, produced a magazine called Honesty, which they used to mobilise people in Melbourne especially, and Victoria. And if you look at the articles, they are exceptionally sophisticated. The Worker and the Boomerang were basically anti-Chinese because they saw the Chinese as competition, cheap labour competition, right? They're anti-Chinese. They're also anti-Jewish to a significant degree. William Lane was a notorious. But the interesting thing about Honesty, the the anarchist publication in Melbourne, is there are significant articles which saw the Chinese as basically exploited workers. And they actually tried to recruit Chinese workers on that basis by producing Chinese inserts in the magazine. This is Honesty. It was published for about 2 years, and the editor was Jack Andrews. Now, Jack Andrews was an exceptionally talented human being, unlike us here today, but I could be wrong. He died at the age of 37 from tuberculosis, but he was an exceptionally talented human being. He was born in Melbourne, I think maybe Ballarat. He spoke 7 languages fluently, including Chinese and Russian. He was a prolific writer, and he lived life basically as a destitute. So in the 1880s and during the big depression of the 1880s, he was one of the leading orators and the pen of the resistance to the depression. Now, Honesty, that particular magazine, was involved in a struggle which led to a number of riots in Melbourne. They were selling about, remember this, Melbourne would have had about 300,000 people then. They were selling 6,000 magazines for each issue. People buying it, you know, people could live off their earnings by selling the magazine, about 6,000. And they were such a force organising demonstrations. They were using honesty as a mechanism, not just to have theoretical discussions. And this is the difference. I mean, these early newspapers were not about giving both sides equal time. They were about giving their side of the story during a period where it was very difficult for people to give their sides of the story, especially working people. And that's what they were about. So Honesty was involved in campaigns which led to the Victorian government offering free land to the unemployed and the destitute in order to get them out of the city. If you ever go to French Island, you'll notice a beautiful picture of about 500 kids at the local French Island school, because every unemployed person who wanted could get 5 acres of useless land on French Island. That got them out of the city. If you go to the Dandenong Ranges, Callista and all those places which are now big time, you were given 5 acres of land as long as you lived there. And, you know, free land. They were given title to free land. There were collectives set up, free land, around Victoria during this period. And again, a lot of this came from the push from the magazines like Honesty, or newspapers like Honesty, which were raising very sophisticated ideas. If you look at the articles in Honesty, there's articles about female emancipation, articles about unions, there's articles about collectivism, there's articles that are against racism. It's like reading something from the 2020s, actually better than the 2020s, and that's almost 150 years ago. Now, so the difference was that then, if you had the intellect and a little bit of capital, you could actually set up your own newspaper. And if you had the people to sell it, they could actually live. I'm sure the direct action mob today would be jealous of this, but you actually lived off selling that newspaper. And those newspapers were not just about giving a intellectual analysis, but they were about organising. They were about encouraging people to organise. Now, it wasn't all hunky-dory, and I'll tell you a funny story. Now, what was his name? Chummy Fleming was a well-known Melbourne anarchist, a bit of an eccentric, bootmaker by trade, came out here when he was 11, I think, or 12. And he was a member of the Melbourne Anarchist Club, good old Chummy Fleming. He died in 1853, and those of you who go along who are interested in May Day, I do a little tour on the 1st of May, going through these anarchist haunts. He's the only anarchist I know that actually has a little laneway named after him, Chummy Lane. Chummy Lane, well, misspelled, but the English way, Chummy Lane in Carlton. Now, Chummy Fleming wasn't much of a writer, he was more of a propagandist. You know, he did things. But the fascinating thing is that if you go to the Melbourne Library, you can actually still see the flags that Chummy Fleming used during his campaign in the 1870s and 1880s, that they've been collected there. The State Library. You can actually get every issue of Honesty is online. You can actually access that, and you can also access some of this stuff online through the State Library. But what's the fascinating thing about Chummy Fleming is that in the 1870s, he began a movement to open the State Library on Sunday. He began the movement, right? He organised a number of demonstrations because he believed the working class should have the option of going to the library, not just church on Sunday, because that's the only day that working people had off. And he was arrested, as he's usually arrested. He refused to pay his £5 fine, and he was jailed. Right? And he was a bit disappointed about being jailed because nobody came and visited him, right? Because he's a bit of an oddity, old Chummy. But the thing is, Chummy Fleming's movement grew, and the State Library was opened on Sunday in the late 1870s. But guess what? 6 months later it was closed because no working people went to the library on Sunday. They had better things to do. So that's the other thing you've got to remember is the role of the Mechanics Institutes, which you see everywhere now. In those days, the Mechanics Institute, although many of them were set up by business people, but the Mechanics Institute was to actually educate workers to read and write. And there are a number of journals and newspapers which were there for people to access freely. So people would go to the Mechanics Institute if they were interested. And there was a lot of interest, and that's why there's Mechanics Institute. They were used as meeting rooms. They were used to create little local newspapers, which obviously have disappeared. So the story is that there were many radical newspapers. They all failed. We even had an edition of the Punch, the London Punch, which was published in Melbourne in the 1880s, a satirical, ironical political satire. We had Punch was published in Melbourne in the 1880s. But at the same time, we saw the rise of newspapers which were published by people in authority and who realised that they'd lost the battle in terms of winning the hearts and minds of Australia, of colonial Australia. For example, in 1879, when we had the maritime strike, and the maritime strike occurred because, again, every time there's a depression, you saw the destruction of the emerging trade union movement. And in 1879, there was a strike down the east coast. It was the first intercolonial strike: Tasmania, Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland. And the strike occurred because there was a depression. The ship owners stood down all their European crews and put on Chinese crews for 1/5 of the wages. All right, so they used race to suit them, and that's why there was a lot of this antagonism. But because of the newspapers of the day, although the Victorian government, banned demonstrations and set up machine gun nests on Parliament House, over 60,000 Victorians marched to, that's about 15% of the population, that's men, women and children, marched to support the maritime strike. And that came about through newspapers like Honesty and other newspapers, the Boomerang, other newspapers which were around at that particular point in time. So they're a great mechanism via which to communicate. These days you walk into a coffee shop, there are no newspapers. Minimal. Well, the ones I walk into anyway. They don't read there. But in those days, newspapers were the main mechanism of communication, and they moulded opinion regarding particular issues. So what's happened? Because I like to join things. What's happened? As the process after Federation, as the process of producing papers became more and more expensive, what we saw is the collapse of local newspapers. Now, those of you who may have remembered the Bulletin, which was established in 1880. Remember when Mr. Packer bought the Bulletin and closed it down before his 150th anniversary. So there are all these newspapers. Now, the thing about these newspapers, I'll just go back a step, something I remembered. Now, when William Lane, when they lost the shearers' strike, he set up a new movement to leave the country. I know a lot of you are thinking of leaving the country after the no vote, all right? Well, he organised it. After the failed shearers' strike and the fail of the working class to actually win any real advances, William Lane set up a new movement, and they were looking for land to set up communes. So they eventually settled on Paraguay because it was cheap. They chartered a ship with what was described as the cream of the working class, the intellectuals, and they all went to Paraguay to set up this new society. And within about 2 years, it had split, and there was one group called COSME, C-O-S-M-E, I think, yeah, and they set up this new faction of about 57 people, and they had their own newspaper. And they did it every day. And it was handwritten. Wow. And guess what? Who was the editor? The famous Mary Gilmore. Nice. Yes. It's very funny. She was the great poet and politician Mary Gilmore was the editor of the Paraguayan Cosme collective. Now, if you do go to Paraguay today, well, you do travel, you may go back. There are still descendants, yes, most of them came back, but some stayed, intermarried with the locals. And there are still descendants with English names who don't speak any English anymore, speak Spanish, in Paraguay of that particular community. But what I found interesting was the fact they had their own newspaper. Every evening, handwritten, and they read it. The news of the day in this little outpost of Australia. So what's happened is, well, obviously mechanisation meant that you couldn't set up a little newspaper, if your little Gestetner or amateur printing press. You needed to employ more people. You became an employer, like David Syme became an employer, and then it becomes a corporation. So, what is the equivalent of a 19th century newspaper in Australia today? And I think the equivalent is the podcast. Now, there are podcasts about everything, but the thing about a podcast is it's cheap to produce, it's relatively easy to produce, it can be produced by one person or two people, and in the majority of cases, like most of my podcasts, the listenership is minimal, but there is that potential with the podcast, there is that potential to mirror the radical newspapers of the 19th century. I mean, community radio is an undertaking. It's not the same thing. It needs an organisation, it needs capital, it needs fundraising, it is contained by government regulation. So I think the podcast in many ways, irrespective of its content, there's different podcasts about different things, is a mechanism via which we can actually mirror the influence that 19th century newspapers had. I'll give you an example. We had a guest on Radical Australia today, and what has he got? He's got a podcast. Everybody's got a podcast, who's anybody. But the thing is, it is a mechanism via which you can get ideas across in the 21st century. You could never. I remember when I was producing the Anarchist Age Weekly Review, which is for about 25 years at Fowles Edition, I actually had an application come in from a respected journalist wanting a job. You like that? A paid job on the Anarchist Age Weekly Review, which was run by volunteers. He thought, oh, I can actually make a living. Now, we can't. With a podcast, it's very little investment apart from your time. Very little investment. And that's what's the thing about those periods. Now, there were periods in history where leaflets, this is the 19th century, were actually, people didn't have the money to typeset or the money for the little, little typesetting. So they used to carve their message in wood. And there was a magazine called Anarchy, which was produced by, again, Jack Andrews when he went walkabout through New South Wales in the 1890s after the Honesty folded. And he used to carve the letters in wood. And I've got an example of it. He used to carve the letters in wood and then do prints, woodblock prints. So where there is, see, Jack Andrews was he had quite a revolutionary position. He was very interesting because again he was jailed. After Seekamp, he was the next person who was jailed for producing what they called a unregistered publication, because by the 1890s all publications had to be registered with the state because they were concerned about the reach that all these publications were having. And because he didn't have a stamp on the back of his little publication, which was called Anarchy, he was jailed for 3 months. So, I'm happy to take questions. I know it's a bit generic. I could go through all the names of all of them, but there's really no point. So, questions?
It's not a question, but you are right about the Murdoch-Packer thing, because the Packer family started off really well. Keith Packer was a really good guy, right? And his son Frank wasn't too bad. It changed, not as awfully as the Murdochs changed, but you were right, it was the Murdochs
who got the press.
Were actually okay.
So they actually acquired that press from the New South Wales Trades and Labour Council, which I think was a wonderful thing. Got them going. But that's the dilemma. As technology changes, as culture changes, as people's opinions changes,
No.
Well,
so there was a show on TV about the gold rush. There was a woman who started up her own paper. Is that fiction?
That's fiction. There's this thing in many regards in other circles, and I won't mention the particular academic, who highlight the fact that, I have never seen anything. I've never seen anything at the Eureka Museum. I've never seen anything. Now, obviously, you can interpret things in many ways, and there may have been. It doesn't really matter if there was or there wasn't. There may have been. But again, to start up a paper, you still needed capital.
Well, that particular character did have.
What she's talking about is the wife of Henry Seekamp, who ran. That's right.
That's right. She took over from.
That's right. Yeah. The character was when Henry Seekamp was jailed for 3 months. The editor of the Ballarat Times, she took over the editorial position, and then when he died, she took over the newspaper. But that was many years after the Ballarat.
She wanted to include the Chinese population because.
Yeah. So it would have been Henry Seekamp's partner. Yeah, and that's the only thing I can think of. Yeah.
When you said that the Eureka stockade that couple of days failed, and it did, the actual barricade. Was it not though the precursor to the not the trade unionism we have now, because that's pretty fucked up. Was it not the precursor to Australian trade unionism?
No, the precursor to Australian trade unionism was the ascendancy of the tradesperson, mainly the stonemasons.
Oh, yeah.
They were the first one. They actually formed it. What happened with the Eureka Rebellion is it opened the floodgates. In 1856, what's his name? Jardine Charles Don was elected to the Legislative Assembly as a result of the changes to the laws regarding, as the member for Collingwood. And at that particular point in time, people weren't being paid to represent Parliament. They used to sit at night, and his slogan was, his electoral slogan was, he used to smash bluestone during the day and squatters at night. That was his big thing. So it opened up the gates to a lot of radical things. Now people think, because you had the council was still controlled by the squatters, the 700 men mainly, who had all the land in Victoria, and they wanted to make sure the Legislative Assembly didn't have the power to challenge their monopoly on land. And you'll see for 30 years after the Eureka Rebellion, there's this constant battle. Now, it didn't just happen in Parliament. There was an alternative Parliament which was set up, which I've spoken about. And the alternative Parliament was set up where the Southern Cross Hotel used to be. And they met there for over 10 years. There were huge riots.
The Southern Cross in Elizabeth Street.
Where it used to be.
Oh,
Whatever it is.
where the Beatles stayed.
No, that's
Yeah, where the Beatles, Southern
Yeah, I know the hotel.
in Collins.
Colin. No, on the
No, it's
corner.
on Elizabeth-
Exhibition.
I
Yeah, we
used
used
to
to
work down the road
No,
from
that,
Yeah, Southern Cross.
no, that's where the age was.
No,
the
no,
Ace
no,
was
no.
down at Flinders,
Lonzo.
Oh, yes,
Spencer
in
Street.
Spencer Street, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You'll think it's Southern Cross Station.
No, I think it's Southern Cross. I thought it was in Collins.
No,
No, no.
exactly Elizabeth
Ex-
Street, diagonally across from where I work.
Collins Street?
No, Exhibition
No,
Street.
No,
The
Elizabeth.
Southern Cross.
Exhibition.
Street, I do beg your pardon, Exhibition.
Yeah, we used to protest there. Exhibition Street. It's the corner of Collins and Exhibition.
Maybe that's what I was
And the
thinking.
Beatles, except
Yeah, it was
Ringo,
in Collins.
came out.
Yeah,
of
so
the
what I'm...
Anyway,
And you've got to remember the free education movement came out of the Eureka Rebellion. All these things came out of the Eureka Rebellion. Because if you look at the history of the other states, they lagged decades behind in terms of changes. Because the Eureka Rebellion was not just about a rebellion, it was about cultural changes based on access to land.
So is that why we kind of
Have a more radical, outlook.
We have a, you know, yay, Eureka Stockade.
Well, we don't, unfortunately, anymore.
no, we don't.
We don't. There's no very... Look,
That was the only rebellion in Australia in a sense.
well, yeah, apart from the poor convicts in 1810 who got all hung. Yeah, but that's a different story. Vinegar Hill, 1804. And guess what the password was to get into the Eureka Stockade in 1854? Vinegar Hill. And there's the connection.
Right.
Yeah,
Maintaining the story.
yeah, yeah. Any more questions before we get stuck into Gaz's grub?
The bulletin that was bought and then they
Yeah, closed it, yeah.
Before the big anniversary.
Well, the bulletin was very important for the career of Henry Lawson. I mean, a lot of the radical poets, you know, and actually used the bulletin as the magazine via which they, you know, spoke to the Australian people. I mean, it all revolves around, you know, the shearers' strike of 1891, the creation of the Bulletin. The Bulletin had a wider readership. The Bulletin was actually a real newspaper. It was more of a magazine. It wasn't specifically orientated to a particular group like the Shearers' Advocate or the trade union papers which were around at that particular point in time. Like Punch was, you know, a satirical magazine, which was a co-creation of, you know, from London.
So was it losing money or deliberately closed down or something?
I assume by that time, the fact was it didn't fit into the Packers' empire, and it was closed down because it really wasn't making much money. By the 1980s, magazines were going out of fashion. You had TV.
In Australia.
Yeah.
Weekly
Yeah.
and all that, it was all changing or something.
Yeah. So it was a commercial decision.
Clear.
You buy the masthead, you close it down.
And the thing about these podcasts,
Yeah.
rather than newspapers, is that, and this drives me mad, people just go, right, that's how they react to everything. No, well, I'd rather see boots on the ground than that. That means
Yeah.
nothing.
No, yeah, I agree with that, but to get boots on the ground, you need the background. Without the struggle, you will not get boots on the ground, and that's the purpose of a podcast. What do you think I do a podcast for the Anarchist World this week, or Radical Australia? Well, I don't. I have talented people who do it for me. But the reason you do it is because to get boots on the ground. Well, what do we used to do leaflets for in the old days with the Gestetner? Boots on the ground. And that's what they did then, was to get boots on the ground.
Yeah, yeah.
But I agree with you, the majority of people go, and I call them the internet warriors.
I call keyboard warriors.
Oh, I call them internet, yeah.
They're rubbish.
Well, you hope, look, they're not rubbish.
Are you using it? What? Are you getting information from the online?
Thank you, Oscar.